Hi everyone, it's Meredith here from Loose Ends in Kemptville, Ontario. Today I thought I would put together a short video to show you my process from concept to transferring an image to a block for creating a linocut illustration. The piece you see here is going to be in the next COVID haiku book for the project I'm working on with Katie Nolan, an author here in Kemptville. And I'm just going to show you how the piece gets moved from the initial sketch onto the block. I'm not going to be demonstrating the actual carving technique in this video. So I folded this up because I don't want to give away too many of the illustrations that are going to appear in the next book. But this is the pencil doodle I put together for this piece. So I blocked in how I'm going to use the space, the general objects and subject in the image. From there, I take a piece of tracing paper, which you'll see looks like this, but when you hold it against something, you can see through it very well to trace. So I put the tracing paper over top of my initial sketch, and then I use a felt tip pen, usually not something quite as small as this micron, usually a thicker marker version of a pen like this. And I create a slightly more detailed drawing. So I've generally gone over top of the main shapes that I've blocked in, but in this case, I'm starting to put in some line work that's going to actually guide how I'd like to carve the block to create some of the textures and shadows and that sort of thing. And once I've created this little marker drawing, I usually have a bunch of these for all the different illustrations that I'm doing in the case of illustrating a book. And I put that in my scanner. And when I scan it in, I print it out at roughly the size of the block. These blocks are around 4 by 6 inches. And I sort of eyeball it when I'm looking at the size of the preview of the image on my computer screen. I know that the paper is 8.5 inches wide, so I try and have the illustration represent about half the width of the paper when I see it on there. Okay, from that point, what I do is I put a blank piece of tracing paper down, and I'll place my block on top, and I trace around the outline of the block so I know exactly the location of the edges of the block when I'm putting it over my image. Now you'll see in this one, you can still see the edges of where I blocked in. I'm not carving a border on the piece. This is more so I know that if my illustration doesn't go all the way to the edges, which you can see in this one, it actually ends here, which is a little bit short of the top edge of the block. I'll modify my line work a bit and extend it all the way to the edges, and same with at the bottom. I filled in a few little gaps around the edges of the piece. You'll notice that I'm working in pencil. This is a 2B pencil. I usually work in an HB for this. I just happen to have this one handy, but any sort of softer lead, HB, 2B, beyond that, you end up with something a little bit too soft that's going to smudge while you're working on it, but it needs to be a soft enough lead that it will actually rub off of the tracing paper onto your linoleum block. So I'm working in pencil. I try to go over all of the lines that I put in that I want to include in the carving. In some cases, for example, these sort of glowy bars that I've put in to create a dynamic background, I haven't colored them all in because I know when I transfer them that these are going to be a solid color. Sometimes I'll just scribble like this over top so that when I transfer it, I see that I've blocked that in to be part of the block that's going to remain. And anything that's white, the inside of this figure or behind the figure, some of these light colored masks, those are all going to be carved away because whatever I remove from the block is not going to take ink, and whatever remains on the edge of the block will pick up ink when I roll the ink roller over top. So once I finish coloring in the pencil work, and again, you can see I'm essentially redrawing the same drawing each time. I have a guide underneath, but it gives me opportunities to sort of modify or refine my drawing at each stage. And again, when I carve it, there's a bit of freedom there as well, because sometimes I'll work around lines slightly differently based on how I feel it's coming together. And I'll just take this off. This is just a low stick painter's tape, masking tape. That way it won't rip my tracing paper. And I'll put my block down. This block actually has another illustration on the back, which again I won't show you because I want to keep some of them as surprises for the book. But as long as you're not carving too deeply into the block, you can use both sides of these, which I like to do because it's a little more environmentally thoughtful to do so, because it means that I'm using fewer of these rubber blocks. So I'll just place that there. Next thing I'm going to do is flip my tracing paper over. Your image is going to end up being backwards on the plate. So this technique is especially helpful if you're carving something that has text in it, because if you carve, well, even this $sign actually, if I were to carve it like this into the block, when I print it, it's going to get flipped again, and I would end up with it being backwards in the final piece. So you're tracing the image in its true orientation. You're flipping it so that it's mirrored, and then when it prints, it'll flip again. So what you want to do is line up those edges that you traced on your paper to the edges of the block as best you can, which is sometimes a little tricky. Right now I'm kind of leaning around my camera, so that's not helping too much. There we go. It's kind of easy at the bottom where I have this darker color. I can see where it's blocking out the pink of the block. So I'm going to keep my fingers near the center to make sure that this paper doesn't shift around. And then you just take your thumb, sort of this side edge of your thumb, and you just rub over top of the tracing paper. And what this is doing is pressing the graphite from your pencil onto the surface of the block. And because it's a soft lead that smudges easily, it's going to, particles of it are going to essentially rub off onto the block so that you have an image to carve around. Some people who do more of a free carving technique will actually color their block in with a Sharpie and then carve an image into that, because the black that remains when they carve around shows them what their finished image is going to look like. And I haven't tried that technique. I've done a little bit of free carving when I'm in a hurry to do some little detail pieces, little odds and ends on small linocuts, but I prefer to use this method. So it lets me plan my work, plan my composition. So you want to make sure as you rub the piece, if the paper shifts, take a minute to just recenter it really carefully. Otherwise you'll end up with sort of a blurry image, which is harder to carve from. So I'm going to lift this off, and as you can see, ta-da, the illustration is now on the block. And there's some areas where it's come out a bit late, but I know enough of what my plan was, and I have these other sketches that I can interpret that as I'm carving it. And you can see here where I scribbled into that space to remind me that this is going to be solid, and I just know from my plan that I'm going to be going around all of these little lines in the background. So I hope that was a insightful and helpful demonstration. If you decide to get into linocut printmaking, it's a really fun technique to use. These tools are easy to source from different art supply stores. This is again the Speedball carving multi-head carving tool that comes with all the different nibs for carving. They're in different shapes and widths for the amount of linoleum you're trying to remove between elements. And you can get these Speedball carving blocks in different sizes. And you can also cut these. So if you get one of these and you want to make a couple of small lino cuts, you can cut it with a pair of heavy-duty scissors or with an X-Acto knife. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.